Hey there, welcome back. This is Christopher, and this is Animal Attacks. In this episode, we dive into criminals who got mauled by dangerous animals, from an illegal trader that got attacked by its own animal, to an unlicensed wildlife guide that got too close to a wild predator. These stories represent the dangerous activities that come with consequences. It was March 14th, 2014, on the outskirts of a mid-sized provincial city in the Philippines, where the dry season had already baked the ground hard and the air carried the sharp smell of dust and diesel. The warehouse district sat at the edge of an industrial road, mostly quiet on weekday mornings, with corrugated metal rooftops and chain-link fencing lining the lots. Nothing about the area suggested anything unusual was happening inside one of those rented units, until it did. Rico Velasquez, 32, had spent several years working the circuit of provincial fairs and traveling animal shows, handling everything from pythons to small primates. He was let go after repeated complaints from coworkers about rough handling and a general disregard for containment protocols. Not isolated incidents, but a pattern that coworkers had flagged multiple times before management finally acted. Peers described him as impulsive and difficult to correct, someone who interpreted experience as immunity and treated every animal he worked with as a problem to be managed, rather than a living thing with its own capacity for danger. After losing steady work, he didn't step back and reassess. He drifted into debt and eventually into the margins of the exotic animal trade, moving animals for small trafficking groups operating through informal networks across the region. By early 2014, Rico had become a mid-level transporter, not the organizer, but trusted enough to manage live animals during short holding periods. He was not a trained veterinarian, had no formal certification in large carnivore handling, and operated entirely on instinct and habit. The animals he moved were not pets or rescues. The animal in his care that week was a juvenile Bengal tiger, roughly 14 months old and already approaching the upper end of its developmental weight range, somewhere between 180 and 220 pounds, depending on the individual. Bengal tigers are among the largest cat species on Earth, capable of reaching over 500 pounds at full maturity. Even juveniles carry significant muscle density and jaw pressure. In the wild, Bengal tigers are solitary ambush predators, relying on concealment and explosive short-range charges. When cornered or stressed, they do not retreat, they escalate. This particular animal had already endured multiple transfers across different holding sites, each one adding to a cumulative history of stress and mishandling that Rico had contributed to directly. It was underweight, dehydrated, and showing visible signs of chronic stress. Neighbors near the warehouse had reportedly heard low, sustained growling in the days before March 14th, a detail that, had anyone with authority known about it, would have ended the operation before it reached that morning. A sedative had been administered to prepare the tiger for transport, but the dosage had been estimated without proper weight measurement and was only partially effective. The animal was sedated enough to appear sluggish, but retained full capacity for a defensive response. Rico, under pressure from buyers expecting delivery, made the decision to enter the enclosure alone, rather than wait for the sedative to take full effect or for additional personnel to arrive. There was no licensed veterinarian present, no emergency protocol, and no one on site with the training to manage what happened next. The enclosure was a reinforced cage assembled inside the warehouse, functional for short-term holding, but with no secondary barrier, no separation gate, and no safe room for a handler to retreat into. Once inside, Rico had no exit option that didn't require passing the animal. The tiger reacted the moment Rico moved to guide it toward the transport crate. The strike was immediate and targeted. Rico sustained catastrophic injuries to his upper body and neck. He did not survive the encounter. Emergency responders who arrived after a neighbor reported sounds of a disturbance confirmed his death at the scene. Authorities seized the tiger and, in the course of their investigation, uncovered evidence linking Rico to a broader trafficking network operating across several provinces, buyers, intermediaries, and holding sites that had been running for years under the radar of local enforcement. From what I've studied, every variable in that enclosure, a stressed animal, a partial sedative, no secondary containment, a single handler, created conditions where a fatal outcome became highly likely. The tiger wasn't acting out of character. It was doing exactly what a cornered, frightened predator does. Rico's confidence in his own experience removed the caution that might have kept him alive, and the animal that killed him had been suffering under his care and the care of people like him for months before that morning. The next story moves to open water before sunrise. A different environment entirely, but the same pattern of a person placing themselves exactly where they shouldn't be. It was July 22nd, 2016, along a protected coastal estuary in the Northern Territory of Australia, where the pre-dawn air was thick with humidity and the mangroves stood black against a sky that hadn't yet decided to lighten. The water moved slowly through the channel, dark and opaque, carrying the smell of salt and decomposing vegetation. At that hour, the estuary was completely still. No boats, no voices, nothing but the occasional call of a nightbird and the quiet sound of water against roots. Darren Cole, 41, had been working the edges of illegal wildlife trade for years, focusing primarily on reptiles, animals that could be sold for skins, live export, or parts. He had a record of prior offenses and had avoided serious prosecution through a combination of careful timing and a network of contacts who moved product quickly. Colleagues in the trade described him as methodical, but increasingly reckless, someone who had gone too long without consequences, and had started to treat risk as something that happened to less experienced people. What made Darren particularly dangerous, to himself and to the ecosystems he operated in, was that he wasn't careless out of ignorance. He understood the law well enough to work around it, understood protected species classifications well enough to target the most valuable ones, and understood enforcement patterns well enough to time his operations around them. He wasn't stumbling into illegal activity. He was running it deliberately, with the kind of calculated confidence that comes from years of not getting caught. Financial pressure in mid-2016 pushed him toward higher value targets. The estuary he had identified was known locally to hold a large saltwater crocodile, a fully protected species under Australian law, and by extension, a high-value target for the black market, where live specimens and skins commanded significant prices. Darren had set multiple baited lines along the bank over several nights, returning before sunrise each time to check them while foot traffic was minimal. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptile species on Earth. Adult males in Australian estuaries regularly exceed 13 feet in length and can weigh over 1,000 pounds. They are ambush predators of exceptional patience, capable of remaining almost completely submerged for extended periods with only their eyes and nostrils above the waterline. Their strike from a stationary position is among the fastest of any large predator. A lunge from the water can close distance in a fraction of a second. On the morning of July 22nd, Darren approached one of his lines that had been disturbed overnight. He crouched near the water's edge to inspect it, leaning forward to check the tension on the line. Based on investigators' assessment of the scene, the crocodile had almost certainly been drawn to that stretch of bank by the bait over the preceding nights and was positioned just beneath the surface within striking range. Darren did not detect it. The attack came without warning. The crocodile lunged from close range, seizing him and pulling him into the water. A death roll followed, the rotational technique saltwater crocodiles use to disorient and incapacitate prey, which generates enough torque to tear tissue and fracture bone simultaneously. Search teams operating later that morning recovered evidence of the struggle along the bank. Darren was declared deceased. Authorities used the case in subsequent enforcement briefings, noting that the baited lines themselves had likely concentrated the crocodiles' attention on the exact stretch of bank where Darren was working. The lines were still in place when investigators arrived. Evidence of an ongoing illegal operation that had been running for days before it ended the way it did. I've looked at a number of crocodile fatality cases in my research, and what stands out here is how the setup created its own trap. The bait that was meant to draw the crocodile in for capture drew it in, just not in the way Darren intended. Crouching at the water's edge in low light, near active bait lines in a known crocodile habitat, is about as close to a guaranteed encounter as you can engineer. The animal behaved exactly as it should have. Darren had spent years exploiting protected wildlife for profit, and on that morning, the last animal he tried to take didn't cooperate. The next story moves away from the water entirely, but the outcome is no less final, and the margin for error was just as thin. It was November 3rd, 2015, somewhere in the rural interior of Western Russia, where the first hard frost of the season had already settled into the ground, and the birch trees stood stripped and pale against a gray sky. The facility, if it could be called that, was a collection of weathered outbuildings on a private plot, the kind of place that didn't appear on any official registry and attracted no attention from the road. The air smelled of cold mud and animal waste. The nearest town was several miles away. Leonid Petrov, 38, had worked briefly at a small regional zoo before being dismissed following a series of incidents involving negligence and alcohol. He was described by former co-workers as volatile, prone to confrontation, and deeply resistant to being corrected by anyone he considered beneath him. The dismissal hadn't been a single event. It had been the end of a long process of documented complaints, warnings, and overlooked incidents that eventually became impossible to ignore. After losing that position, he didn't pursue legitimate work in animal care. He moved through a series of informal arrangements, roadside attractions, private animal displays, underground entertainment operations, each one less regulated than the last, each one a step further from any environment where someone might hold him accountable. He wasn't forced into these roles by circumstance. He gravitated toward them because they were the only places that would take him and because the absence of oversight suited him. By late 2015, Leonid was responsible for a captive brown bear of Siberian origin, an adult male that had been passed between at least 3 unregulated facilities over the course of several years. The bear had no documented veterinary history, no behavioral assessments, and no record of how it had been acquired, which, in the context of the operation Leonid was working for, almost certainly meant it had entered the country through illegal channels. The animal was malnourished, chronically stressed, and housed in an enclosure with a sliding gate mechanism that had been reported as unreliable on multiple occasions. No repairs had been made. The people running the facility had no legal authorization to hold the animal, no insurance, no emergency protocols, and no relationship with any veterinary service that could have been called if something went wrong. Brown bears are among the most powerful land mammals in the northern hemisphere. Adult Siberian brown bear males can weigh between 400 and 660 pounds and are capable of generating enormous force in a single strike. Their claws, which can reach 4 inches in length, are designed for digging, but function as devastating weapons in an attack. Brown bears in captivity, particularly those subjected to chronic stress, inadequate nutrition, and repeated handling, do not habituate to humans in a way that reduces aggression. They become unpredictable. A bear that has been handled repeatedly without incident can shift toward a full attack with signals that are often subtle or easily missed by untrained handlers. Jaw popping, a shift in posture, a low huff, before the response becomes physical and immediate. On November 3rd, Leonid attempted to move the bear into an adjacent holding pen. Rather than using a proper chute system or secondary containment, neither of which the facility possessed, he opened the sliding gate manually while attempting to direct the animal with noise and a metal rod. The gate failed to latch properly during the process. Investigators believe the bear forced its way back through the opening before Leonid could reposition himself. With no secondary barrier and no exit route that didn't require passing the animal, Leonid had nowhere to go. The bear attacked inside the enclosure. He sustained severe injuries and died before medical assistance could reach the site. The facility was shut down in the days following, and investigators uncovered multiple animal welfare violations across the property, animals in inadequate enclosures, no documentation for any of them, and evidence suggesting the operation had been running for years without any regulatory contact whatsoever. What I keep coming back to in cases like this is the gate. That locking mechanism had been flagged before. The decision to proceed with a transfer using equipment that was known to be unreliable, without any backup containment, removed the last margin of safety from an already dangerous situation. The bear didn't do anything unexpected. The enclosure did exactly what a broken enclosure does. And the animal that had been kept in illegal, inadequate conditions for years, moved between facilities that had no business holding it, responded the way any large, stressed predator responds when it finds an opening. The next case is a different kind of danger entirely. Smaller, faster, and with almost no window between the moment things go wrong and the point where they can no longer be corrected. It was May 9, 2013, in a mid-sized city in the American Southeast, where a warm spring evening had settled into the kind of humid stillness that keeps windows open and carries sound farther than it should. The neighborhood was residential, modest houses, shallow yards, the occasional dog barking somewhere down the street. Nothing about the exterior of the house suggested what was being kept inside. Marcus DeLuca, 29, had built a small but visible online presence around his reptile collection, posting photos and short videos that positioned him as an experienced handler. In reality, he had no formal training, no certification, and no professional background in venomous reptile management. Friends described him as attention-driven and dismissive of precautions, someone who treated safety protocols as obstacles that applied to less capable people. His collection had grown steadily through informal trades and, increasingly, through illegal acquisitions. Animals obtained through channels that bypassed import regulations, species-specific possession laws, and the permit requirements that exist precisely because of how dangerous they are. The king cobra he obtained in early May 2013 came through an illegal exchange, the kind of transaction that moves animals across state lines without documentation, through networks of collectors and dealers who operate in the gaps between jurisdictions. Marcus planned to show it to a potential buyer and document it for his following. It was, to him, an asset, something that would elevate his reputation and potentially generate income. The fact that possessing it was a criminal offense in his state was, based on his behavior, a detail he had already decided to manage around. King cobras are the longest venomous snake in the world, capable of reaching 18 feet in length. They are not passive animals. Unlike many venomous species that strike defensively and retreat, king cobras are known for sustained threat displays and, when provoked or cornered, repeated strikes. Their venom is primarily neurotoxic. It attacks the nervous system, causing progressive paralysis that moves from the extremities toward the respiratory muscles. A full envenomation from a large king cobra delivers a significant venom load, enough, in documented cases, to cause fatal respiratory failure in a human without rapid access to anti-venom and respiratory support, Death in severe, untreated cases can occur within a few hours, depending on the dose and bite location. King cobras are also capable of delivering dry bites, strikes without venom injection, but there is no reliable way for an untrained handler to determine which type of bite has occurred in the immediate aftermath. On the evening of May 9th, after a period of drinking, Marcus attempted to handle the cobra without a hook or any proper restraint tool. His movements were unsteady. The snake, already in an unfamiliar environment and likely stressed from the recent transfer, became defensive. It struck, delivering a significant envenomation. Marcus initially underestimated the severity of what had happened, a response documented in a number of amateur envenomation cases, where the absence of immediate, dramatic pain leads the victim to delay seeking help. As neurological symptoms progressed, difficulty breathing, progressive weakness, loss of motor control, emergency services were contacted. When they arrived, they found an illegally held king cobra in a residential property alongside other animals whose legal status was immediately questionable. The local medical facility had limited access to appropriate anti-venom, and the delay between the bite and treatment had already allowed the venom to advance significantly. Based on available medical reports, Marcus died at the hospital from complications related to the envenomation. From what I've seen in documented cases, the delay is almost always the factor that turns a survivable bite into a fatal one. King cobra envenomation is a medical emergency from the moment it happens, regardless of how the victim feels in the first few minutes. Marcus's confidence in his own ability to assess the situation cost him the window where intervention might have worked. The next story takes place in open country, in broad daylight, with other people present, and it still ended the same way. It was August 27, 2018, inside a private game reserve in the Limpopo region of South Africa, where the late dry season had turned the bush pale and brittle. The grass stood knee-high and straw-colored, and the afternoon light came in flat and hard across the open ground. Dust hung in the air from the morning's vehicle traffic, and the heat pressed down without relief. It was the kind of afternoon where animals moved slowly and the bush felt deceptively quiet. Ethan Rowe, 35, operated as an unlicensed wildlife guide, arranging close-range animal encounters for paying clients who wanted something beyond what a standard safari offered. He had no formal guiding certification, no liability coverage, and no legal authorization to conduct commercial wildlife excursions, all of which he was fully aware of and had been managing around for years through informal arrangements with reserve contacts and word-of-mouth client referrals. He was charismatic and well-connected within informal tourism networks, and he had a reputation for delivering experiences that licensed operators wouldn't provide, getting clients closer, staying longer, bending the boundaries that regulated guides were required to enforce. That reputation was his business model. The closer the encounter, the more clients paid, and the more they referred others. Every rule he broke was, in his calculation, a selling point. Colleagues described him as someone who had spent enough time around wildlife to stop being afraid of it, which, in practice, meant he had stopped respecting it. Previous excursions had gone without serious incident, and each uneventful outing reinforced his belief that his read on animal behavior was reliable enough to substitute for the training and protocols he had never bothered to obtain. He had been operating this way for years. The reserve he worked in had received complaints about unauthorized excursions before, but enforcement had been inconsistent, and Ethan had learned to time his operations around it. The male lion Ethan had been using as a focal point for client encounters had spent enough time near vehicle traffic to be considered partially habituated, meaning it no longer fled at the approach of a vehicle. Habituation is frequently misread as tameness. It is not. A habituated lion has simply adjusted its threshold for what triggers a response. It remains a fully wild apex predator, and the behaviors that define it, territorial aggression, predatory instinct, sensitivity to movement on foot, are entirely intact. African lions are the second largest big cat species in the world. Adult males can weigh between 330 and 500 pounds and are capable of reaching speeds of 35 to 40 miles per hour in a short charge. Their attack sequence, from the decision to charge to first contact, can close 30 feet in under 2 seconds. Lions targeting prey or a perceived threat on foot do not give extended warning. A tail flick, a shift in posture, and the charge are often a single continuous motion. On the afternoon of August 27th, Ethan exited the vehicle on foot to move closer to the lion and improve the angle for a client's photographs. This was not an impulsive decision made in the heat of the moment. It was consistent with how he had been operating for years, pushing boundaries incrementally because nothing had stopped him yet. The shift from vehicle to foot, a change in silhouette, movement pattern, and proximity altered the dynamic of the encounter entirely. Investigators believe the lion's response was immediate. It charged within seconds of Ethan clearing the vehicle. The distance closed too fast for anyone to intervene safely. Ethan sustained fatal injuries and was pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities who reviewed the incident confirmed that he had been operating without a guide's license and that the excursion itself had no legal standing. The clients present were interviewed and released. The lion was not destroyed. It had done nothing outside the bounds of its natural behavior. I've read through a number of lion attack cases, and the pattern is consistent. The vehicle changes everything. It alters the animal's perception of what it's dealing with. The moment that barrier is removed, the calculation changes instantly, and there is almost no time between that change and the outcome. Ethan had built a business on removing that barrier for paying clients. On August 27th, the lion responded to what it saw, a person on foot, in its territory, at close range. And that was the end of it. The final story in this episode involves an animal that most people underestimate, and a handler who, despite being more calculated than most in this list, made the one mistake that his setup gave him no way to survive. It was January 18th, 2017, somewhere in the interior of Java, Indonesia, where the wet season had turned the air dense and close, and the ground around the facility ran soft with standing water. The building was a converted agricultural structure, low-ceilinged, poorly ventilated, with corrugated walls that trapped heat and amplified sound. It sat at the end of an unmarked access road, surrounded by scrub vegetation, and had no visible signage. From the outside, it looked abandoned. That was intentional. Victor Hahn, 44, was a careful and organized operator within a reptile trafficking network that moved animals across Southeast Asia using forged documentation and staged transport routes. Unlike many in the trade, Victor was not impulsive. He was methodical, detail-oriented, and had been operating without serious incident for years. His network dealt in rare and protected species, animals that commanded significant prices from private collectors and underground dealers across the region. Komodo dragons, as a fully protected species under Indonesian law and listed under international trade conventions, represented one of the highest value targets available. Victor understood the legal framework around them well enough to know exactly what he was violating and how to structure his operations to minimize the chance of detection. The Komodo dragon being held at the facility was an adult male, estimated at just over 8 feet in length and approximately 150 pounds. It had been in the facility for several weeks, underfed, and kept in an enclosure that required manual entry for feeding and maintenance. There was no feeding slot, no remote delivery system, and no secondary barrier. The animal had been acquired through the same illegal channels Victor's network used for all its inventory, with no veterinary assessment, no quarantine period, and no behavioral history. It was stressed, underfed, and had shown increased aggression in the days prior to January 18th, something that had been noted by at least one other person at the facility, but had not resulted in any change to the handling protocol. Komodo dragons are the largest living lizard species on Earth. They are ambush predators with a hunting strategy built around a single, devastating bite, followed by patient pursuit. Their jaws can exert significant crushing force, and their teeth, serrated and recurved, are designed to tear rather than puncture, causing massive lacerating wounds. Research has established that Komodo dragons possess venom glands that produce compounds disrupting blood clotting, a factor that worsens bleeding and contributes to the broader cascade of trauma, blood loss, and shock that makes their bites medically severe. In a confined space, a stressed Komodo dragon is highly likely to press an attack rather than disengage, particularly when there is no room for the animal to retreat and no barrier forcing separation. On January 18th, Victor entered the enclosure alone to deliver food and conduct a visual inspection of the animal. No secondary barrier was in place, no second person was present, and there was no established exit protocol if the animal became aggressive. These were not oversights born of ignorance. Victor had enough operational experience to know what proper containment looked like. The decision to proceed without it reflected the same calculation he had been making for years, that his judgment was sufficient, that the risk was manageable, and that the infrastructure required to do it safely wasn't worth the time or cost. As Victor approached, the dragon reacted. Victor was unable to exit the enclosure quickly enough. By the time others at the facility became aware that something had gone wrong, he had already sustained severe trauma to the lower leg, with extensive lacerations and significant blood loss. There was no medical support on site, no emergency response plan, and no immediate means of stabilizing or transporting him safely out of the remote location. He was found conscious, but in critical condition later that day, with blood loss and shock already advanced. Efforts to move him and reach medical care were delayed by the isolated setting and lack of coordinated emergency response. Victor died before he could receive definitive treatment from complications related to traumatic injury, blood loss, and shock. The operation was dismantled in the weeks following. Investigators identified a broader trafficking network connected to the facility, buyers, intermediaries, and transport routes that had been operating for years. The animals recovered from the site were transferred to wildlife authorities. Several members of the network were identified and faced charges. Victor, the most careful and organized of them, did not survive to face his.